Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
So today I'm with Professor Josef Fahlén, Professor Paul Downward and Dr. Matt Dowling, and we're going to be discussing the Swedish and English sports systems, their impact on sports participation, and what different countries can learn from each other. Those of you who are regular listeners will have heard from Paul Downward before on previous episodes, but today we have some new guests in Josef and Matt. So briefly in a moment, I'll let you introduce yourselves and let the audience know about you. But I am very aware that we asked about this before. And Josef, I told you I would get your name wrong. So can you let the audience know how we actually say your name properly?
Yeah, sure. In Swedish, it would be Josef Fahlén.
Okay, so I'm going to have a go. Josef Fahlén.
That's brilliant.
How many out of 10 is that? You don't need to give me a 10.
It's an 8 at least.
An 8. We'll go with an 8. Okay, that's not a bad start. And Matt, I am getting Matt Dowling correct, I hope.
Yeah, that's right. Matthew Dowling is Matthew Dowling in English. Yeah.
Perfect. So I'm okay with English, not so good on Swedish. So just to get us moving, let our audience aware you are. Josef, can you introduce yourself, please, and let the audience know a little bit about your research?
Yeah, sure. My name is, as said, Josef Fahlén. I work as a professor at Umeå University in the northeast of Sweden. I also do some work at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences as a visiting professor. My research is and has been always concerned with the kind of the intersection between sport policy and the organization of voluntary membership-based sport. Lately, I've also done some work on indigenous sport, Sami sport, in the Scandinavia, the indigenous people, and how their opportunities to preserve their culture and exercise their specific sport activities kind of collide with the Swedish or Scandinavian monopolistic take on how sport should be run.
Thank you. And we're going to touch upon as much as we can. As we've said, it's going to be quite an organic conversation. We've got 3 experts in the room who can talk about lots of this. So Matt, could you introduce yourself as well, please?
Sure. Hi, mine. My name is Dr. Matt Dowling. I'm a senior lecturer in sport management at Loughborough. My background and interest is in sport policy and governance, focusing on not-for-profit sport orgs. And more recently, a lot of my research has focused on the comparative method and how that might apply in the context of sport. So quite interested and fascinated with the conversation today about comparing the English and Swedish context.
Thank you. So yeah, we have, and I don't want you to get shoehorned into these spaces, but we're going to have, Paul's going to look at the English system, Josef's going to look at the Swedish system, Matt's going to come and have some comparison, but do jump in and let's have this conversation to see what we can learn about each other and what we can take away from today. So to get us started, Josef, do you want to just let us know about, how does sport work in Sweden? Very broad question.
Yeah, sure. First of all, a little bit about Sweden. It's a country in the north, 10 million population. We have some 20,000 sport clubs, all voluntary and membership-based, organized, governed by some 70 national sport federation, all under the umbrella of the Swedish Sport Confederation, which acts almost as a government department. We have no sport-specific government department governing sports, so this huge nonprofit organization is granted both resources and authority to govern Swedish sport. So not doing any comparisons, but we don't have the school-based system as prominent in a lot of English-speaking countries. Instead, we have this kind of silent agreement between the state and the nonprofit sport that the state sets up goals for its financial grant, which is somewhere around 200 million pounds yearly. And sport is granted to decide on how these goals best should be achieved. So that's the basic layout of the Swedish kind of sport policy landscape. And as I alluded to previously, the Swedish Sport Confederation has almost kind of a monopolistic standing in the field of sport, and all government funding and all local authority funding goes out to non-profit sport, and you would rarely, if ever, see any funding go to kind of private entities or privately organized sport activities.
Just to clarify, so the one unit of the Swedish Sports Authority, is that for elite sport and participation?
Yeah, that's one of the kind of the features of the Scandinavian sports system is that all organizations carry, or most organizations carry both grassroots sport and elite sport. So even if you take the most successful football clubs, and they aren't very successful by international comparison, they will both play in the European Cup, and they will have grassroots activities for the 6-year-old boys and girls.
Nice. So, Paul, do you want to come in there and just to have a brief overview of the English sports system? Because I mean, there's so many questions I can ask there comparing to what we do over here. But just to set the scene, could you just lay that down for us?
For sure, yes. I think the interesting thing about the UK system we should talk about is that it's always had a common aspiration, which is to enhance the initially physical fitness, but actually in the light of current policy discussions going back to the 1930s, policy documents indicated the need for physical training to enhance human flourishing. So all those objectives have been there. But then there's been one of kind of initial consolidation, but then fragmentation of sport. So we know, of course, that a lot of team sports were developed in effectively the UK. And so there's been a very long-standing tradition of sports club participation, getting formalized, organized through governing bodies. But they only start to get assimilated into state funding up until the sort of 1960s and 70s, when sport gets dragged into being part of what we might think about the welfare state, although it wasn't until the 1970s that there was kind of formal recognition of that with the formation of the Great British Sports Council, which was there to, as we were talking about with Sweden, to harmonise kind of elite sports success and also to encourage mass participation. And for somebody who grew up in the 70s, there wasn't much elite sports success outside of potentially some very notable football clubs of the day. So clearly that's the kind of way in which things happen. But of course, unlike perhaps Sweden, and this is something we can get into later, sort of economically and certainly in policy-wise, to put it crudely, the UK, although certain constituent members of the UK might debate whether their specific countries went this way, but we tilted a little bit towards a more, let's call it, right of centre approach to economic policy, with a much stronger emphasis on market provision. So throughout the period, starting with the first Thatcher government in the 1970s, you get this kind of privatization of industry, and sport goes along with that. So through the development of changes in local authority regulations and so on, services that might have been supplied by the local authority in terms of community facilities start to get outsourced to private sector management companies. You have the growth of the fitness industry as a private sector organization entirely. Obviously, sports clubs remain, but if they're drawing down money, they have to deliver things for policy. So it becomes about what outcomes sport can deliver more than it can for just sport for sport's sake. So we've really been on that trajectory of increasing fragmentation, really, with government funding, if it exists at all within the system, being tied to agencies, and they could be charities, they could be sports clubs, but they could equally be private organizations delivering things on behalf of society, so hitting health and well-being, personal development kind of goals and so on. So we've got a situation that's very different, I feel, to Sweden.
Definitely. And in terms of the difference with the elite sport and participation, so obviously we've got UK sport and we've got Sport England. Do you just want to talk briefly through those two?
Oh, yes, for sure. So the Great British Sports Council, that was formed in 72, under Royal Charter, this gets kind of separated out into under the sort of Blair government, around trying to deliver discrete targets. So UK sport breaks away, and it's there to deliver elite sport success. So it's funding very much tied to delivering medals to put it crudely. And we can see the impact of that was very successful, although there may be some issues around athlete welfare that have come to light as a result of that. But with the medal performances, for example, from Beijing onwards, is without doubt Team GB punches above its weight in some senses in terms of population size and the resources that are available. But then we have regional sports councils remaining and looking after broadly participation in the home nations. So Sport England, as you mentioned, Martin, but Sport Scotland, and then we have the sports councils in Wales and Northern Ireland who look after largely the mass participation side of things. But they will, of course, interact with UK sport in terms of feeding athletes through and supporting them and so on.
And we'll probably touch upon this later, but the remit of Sport England really being around sports participation. And you mentioned UK sports been successful, although, there's certainly been problems as well. Where do we sit with Sport England in terms of measuring success?
Well, it's a really interesting one. And I have to say, my heart always goes out to sports policy delivery agents, because to some extent, elite sport, you've got a very clear objective. You know exactly who your opponents are. You've got some idea what the rules of the game are. You get the best coaches in. You try to deliver the things that you can in terms of success. When you're looking at mass participation, you're looking at societal change, ideological change, all of those kind of big cultural shifts in terms of leisure patterns. And there's this expectation that an organization should deliver, let's say, greater physical activity, because that's what people always talk about now. Sport is part of physical activity. It's about getting a healthier nation and so on and so on and so forth. But trying to deliver that when you've got the rise of virtual technologies, you've got social media engagement, you've got the fragmentation of the entertainment industry, you've got all the lure of passive sport, watching it, you've got the time pressures on people, the income constraints that people think, to try to encourage people to be active is a very tricky thing. So participation rates have been, I would say, relatively static. They declined during COVID. They've come back a little bit, but there's a huge challenge there. And but to lay that at the door of, say, sports councils or something per se is, I think, a bit naive, really. The real issue here is how do we deal with societal change and how can we try and shift people's behaviors so that they're more active? And that's the million-dollar question, actually. But it's a very different animal, I think, than elite sport success, which is why sometimes you can see one of those organizations, say, as succeeding perhaps more than the others.
Again, there's very well articulated, Paul. There's so many questions to go in there with, but I don't want to leave Matt on the sidelines too long. So I want to bring Matt in. Just bring us your thoughts on kind of either or where you sit with kind of comparison, and just add your knowledge to the conversation, and we'll go from there for all of us.
Sure. Yeah, I think really interesting points being raised there by Josef and Paul around kind of getting into, I guess, some of the key structural differences between the systems. But I think, for me, the thing to kind of acknowledge from the outset is like making these kind of comparisons is really quite difficult and problematic. I think for those who sort of study this area, have done kind of comparative work in this space, you realize that making these comparisons is really difficult, and that actually, when you're comparing these, two different systems, if you want to call it that, right? I mean, we could get into a discussion around what do we actually mean by a system, and the kind of the verbiage or terminology that we seem to use at the moment is this idea of like an ecosystem, right? But I mean, fundamentally, these are sort of different systems in the sense of they come very different backgrounds historically, culturally, structurally, as we just talked about, in terms of even the way that the sport system is designed, and also very different kind of socio-political context, which I'm sure we can delve into in a bit. So I think the kind of shorthand temptation is to make these comparisons, and of course we all like to know what's going on over the garden wall in terms of what other countries are doing, and I think politicians and decision makers are quite fascinated with what is going on in other countries, and understandably I think there's this view that we can learn something from what's going on over the fence. But I think, my first kind of comment is to say that we should be really cautious about doing so, and being really clear about kind of what units of measure that we are looking at in terms of comparison. So even in the conversation right now, we've kind of talked about participation. Well, actually, if you compare two different countries, they have very different definitions of what it means to participate. Josef mentioned success. Again, different governments have different definitions of what constitutes success. And typically we assume that means kind of winning medals at the Olympic or Paralympic Games. But again, definition of success in terms of high performance can mean different things in different contexts. So even with what might seem relatively straightforward measures, participation, how many people are taking part in sport, versus how many medals are we winning, again, these are not easy measures to define, and then to make those comparisons is even more challenging methodologically.
Thanks, Matt. I mean, there's loads of good points there. Especially, you do get that piece, don't you? You do hear it a lot. The Scandinavian countries are doing really well. Like, what are they doing? Let's go and steal that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that and looking at that. But the points that you're raising around culture in particular is a big one, I feel, and also structure and system, and all of it brought together makes it really, really difficult to actually go and take something and impact some change, rapidly as people want, because many of these policies come in and you've got 3 years to deliver something, and I think most of the research was it's not going to happen in 3 years. Joseph, I had lots of questions that I could bring in there for you. But can you just add some kind of context, more probably almost like a case study of the how sport works piece? So the funding's coming centrally. Talk us through like a local town or city and how that's felt down to the population level.
Yeah, sure. Try to pick up something of what Paul and Matt also touched upon. So the government grant is designed to go out to sport activities. So what sport clubs do, they report all their activities, they perform training, practice, competition, what have you, and they get government funds, which is based on a calculation of how many and how often and how long. So those 200 million pounds goes primarily out to local sport clubs, but also to national sport federations for their activities, of course. But the main part of the monetary subsidies come from local municipalities, according to the similar formula. So what happens is that all the sport clubs that are a member of a national sport federation, they register all their activity in a kind of centralized system. At the end of the year, they get the funds that matches the amount of activities and participants, coaches and kids. For the kids, it's they have to be between 7 and 25 to be eligible for this support. So also related to elite sport, there are no funds going out to elite sport, and that's kind of part of the silent agreement or the arm's length policy that the government actually implicitly says that if you want to spend your money on elite sport, you're free to do that. But we are not supporting that specifically, because the main thrust of the policy is to support kind of what in Swedish it's called democratic fostering, getting people together. So the only measure that the government is really interested in is how many members do you have, and if the number is okay enough, the government will just keep on handing out money.
And just to clarify, so that money, does it go direct to the clubs or does it go to the municipality?
Yeah, the two parts. The government funding is going, I guess it's channeled through the Swedish Sport Confederation and then to the Swedish Ski Association or Athletic Federation, and then down to the clubs, while the municipal grant is going directly from the local authorities to the sport club. So they get these two fundings that together amounts to some like, what is it, 7-9, like a million or a billion pounds equivalent to, yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's just a lot of money. But for elite sport, clubs or federation are really referred to seeking private funds for that.
And then just to clarify slightly further, what do the participants taking part, do they pay as well to take part?
Yeah, and that differs a lot, and that's a big conversation always ongoing in Sweden. How expensive has sport become? But I would say that if we compare to other systems, even if we should be careful comparing, as Matt said, our kids, my kids, a girl at 18 and a boy at 15, they would pay like a membership fee and a training fee, which would be equivalent to £100 a year.
Okay.
That would grant them the right to participate in the team or in the squad and being sent to competition. But it's all voluntary based, so the coaches, they get no remuneration, and the facilities are paid by the club from the money that they get from the local and central governments.
That was going to be my final question in terms of facilities. So do the club own facilities?
I would say that we have a lot of club-owned facilities, but the majority of all facilities in Sweden are owned by local municipalities because they are essentially school-based municipalities. So the basic idea is that the local municipalities, they fund sport grounds, swimming pools, ice rinks, what have you, for the local schools to use on daytime, on the school day, while it's open to sport clubs to kind of schedule their practices in the evenings and weekends.
And just because that's a really interesting difference. So the sports facilities are often located within or near the school.
Yeah, that's right. 9 out of 10, I would say.
Yeah,
just anecdotally.
And is it seen that they're owned by the local authority, the municipality, or ran by the sports clubs, and the school kind of uses them during the day? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I would say it would be the opposite. That most people would say that, well, if I ask my son where is the practice tonight, he would say at X school. So the basic idea is that, I mean, all schools are owned. 9 out of 10 schools, again, are owned by local municipalities. So we don't have the kind of privatized schools to the extent that I've learned that you have. So it would be the other way around. The schools are the kind of the owner, so to speak, of the facilities, and the clubs, they rent hours in the evenings and weekends.
Paul, do you want to come in and speak to that? And I can probably come in a little bit as well. But that whole system and how it works there is hugely different from what happens at ours.
Absolutely. And I think this is spot on what Matt was saying before about being careful to compare systems. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if we think of team sports and the sports club system, much of what Josef was saying has resonance with our traditional team sports clubs, which would be self-organized. They pre-existed government funding. They've self-governed through their governing bodies and so on. And many of those will own their own facilities. And so you can find, for example, where I'm from, 3 cricket clubs within 4-mile radius of one another, but they don't play one another. So they developed a bit like Topsy historically to do what they wanted to do for their members. Clearly, the call for elite sport and so on kind of has tried to historically to bring some greater coordination to that. But then you've also got these almost like parallel developments, which is the school-based education system, which again, schools would have been historically local authorities in the post-war period with facilities provided by local authority funding. But equally, we should recognize that many schools didn't have playing fields as such. They were literally Victorian schools. So they were built in inner city areas, and they would have a yard where you would play games or something like that. So the big expansion of playing fields and stuff comes in the 1970s with a big push to promote sport and physical activity across the wider community. And then you get almost like 2 strands of spending: local education spending to enhance schools' facilities. I remember we suddenly got this new football pitch to play on when I was at school in the 70s. And until then, we've been kicking, sounds like a Monty Python sketch, a kind of a stone around in a Victorian concrete yard. But then equally, you've got the local authority leisure centres that were developed for the communities. And this is where there was a huge increase in, say, swimming pool provision and so on. So you've got these kind of three strands that are kind of developed with a similar ambition, but they don't kind of fit together in the nice way in which Joseph talks about in terms of Sweden. And that makes it very, very difficult then to try to harmonise and to coordinate community provision. And this is obviously where I know you have some expertise, Martin. In principle, it would seem very rational to use school facilities for local clubs and vice versa. In practice, that turns out to be rather tricky.
Well, I think you're right, Paul. And I think some of the pieces you said there, you've got this, and Matt mentioned culture before, and I'll bring you in shortly, Matt, that there's the culture that, well, each of these sports clubs, they own their own and they are kind of competing with each other. And like you've said, you might have teams right next door to each other in the same town that actually don't get on with each other, which seems bizarre, but is true. You've then got schools who have got some kind of facilities, and then you've got leisure centres that have got other types of facilities. I have seen it working. So some of the research I'm doing in the opening school facilities in this kind of shared space is the place where it works is where it is actually, a leisure centre, and it's with the school. It's in the same location, and it seems to work really nicely. But from my experience, when it comes to schools sharing, if they haven't got the greatest facilities, then, it often doesn't work. Financially, it's not actually that viable for them. And then a lot of them look at the risk involved in, well, these are our facilities. If it's not financially beneficial, why are we going to hire them out when there's a chance of them getting ruined? So they don't. And that is, in general, where things go. Now, I know there's been the OSF that we've been looking at the moment. And, to an extent, some of it's working quite nicely, but some of it's not. But it does come down to the local culture of saying, actually, we just want to work with the community. And I wrote down when you said, Joseph, you said about getting people together is the kind of whole point. And I love that. And I've put getting people together versus winning medals, because from where I'm sitting here, it seems very much like we've actually gone winning medals is the most important thing. Not to say participation isn't, but it does seem a little bit more that we've gone that way, and you've gone, no, it's just about getting people together. And I think there's a huge difference culturally there. Conscious I keep throwing you under a bus, Matt, but could you come in and speak to that? I've tried to kind of, range some of that around culture and around those two differences that I see. But do you see it like that? Do you see it differently? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, Josef's bang on in terms of some of the comments you mentioned around kind of the difference in underlying values, even between the two systems, right? You've got, as Paul alluded to, around the kind of history of the sport development in the UK, a lot of that emphasis has been, particularly over the past 30 years, on high performance sport, right? And so in the 90s, we saw a big shift and emphasis on high performance sport, even way before we hosted the Olympic Games. And so in London 2012. And so I think that, there's a clear step change here in the UK in terms of its overall emphasis on high performance sport, often I'd argue at the expense of participation. And I think, even the underlying values of how and where money is being invested between these two systems is very, very different. So, and as Paul mentioned, because of the kind of twin track funding investment approach that we have with UK sport and high performance sport and Sport England and participation, that unsurprisingly money kind of gets siphoned down those natural channels to achieve particular outcomes. And I think one of the biggest differences between the two systems is that kind of level of accountability and the mechanisms that we have in place between how we're spending money and what return on investment and what impact that we're expecting to have. And historically in the UK, we've kind of focused on hard numbers of participation, numbers and also medals. But I think what we're seeing is government shift towards more broader social outcomes and wider social impact. And so I think we're shifting towards that, but the underlying values here are quite different between the two systems. So that makes it difficult to make those comparisons.
I think that's a big thing, Matt, that underlying values. And you see it, I'm coaching under nines football. And one of the things I've seen, it'd be interesting to see if this is happening in Sweden, is the privatization of voluntary sport. Now, whether this is me thinking in my head, whether some of it's born out of there's certain research around the primary school premium, the primary school sport premium. Over the last 10 years, there's been massive investment into primary schools and sport. But a lot of the schools have spent that money on private coaches coming into schools. I think that may have facilitated the kind of private coaching companies to then go, well, we can expand outside of schools as well now. And, there are endless football in particular. There are endless football academies that have cropped up everywhere, and it's kind of £10 to come and play and have an hour's coaching session. There's lots of one-on-one football coaching now from private companies. And I'm doing voluntary football coaching for my local football club. But there must be, and I'm just talking, in Nottinghamshire here now, I know of about 3 or 4 private academies, and most of the lads, most of my team are doing this as well on the side of what they're doing. It's been around in tennis for a long time, where it's all private kind of coaching, but you can potentially see that from almost a class divide type piece. But it's happening in what traditionally was a working class sport in football, is a massive space for private organisations to come in and deliver sport now. Are those kind of things happening in Sweden as well?
Yeah, they are. And there's a lot of debate about how the system, so to speak, is supposed to handle this. So far, the government, in the same boat as the Swedish Sport Confederation, has chosen to the kind of the hard line on that, saying that, well, we can't hinder kids from buying, or parents buying these private coaches, but all public subsidies are going out to the only organization that is eligible for subsidies are the non-profit membership-based sport club. So the private side of things, they can do whatever they want, but they can't expect funding, and and that's kind of the key point. They can't book facilities, because the only entity that can book facilities in these centralized systems are sport clubs. So you can do what you want, but you won't get any funding for it, and you won't be able to rent the facilities that you might need for doing that. So even though we might see that, as you, Martin, being a coach in a sport club, you would, in the Swedish system, also perhaps be a private coach offering your expertise for money on the side, but you can't do that in the for obvious reason in the club facility. And if you're not a sport club, you wouldn't be able to rent a facility either. Lately, we've seen some efforts to trying to find the loopholes here. So what people like you, Martin, would do would be to start a sport club, which isn't really a sport club, to be able to get the kind of the similar grants and facility access that a normal sport club would do. But the sport federations are quite good at locating these kind of entities and cracking down on them.
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure what the best way to go is with this, because if I look at it, and I look at football obviously being the biggest sport we have really here for youth, there's lots of volunteers, and all very willing volunteers, but potentially some might not be as qualified as some of these private organisations. So, I've been to some of these private places, gone, do you know what, the quality of this is really good. Gymnastics was another one. Gymnastics used to be a lot more local authority. Now there's gymnastics organisations who are purchasing or leasing warehouses, turning them into gymnastic spaces, and actually delivering some absolutely brilliant stuff. So I'm not necessarily against it. I just think it's a really interesting change that's going on. Paul, I know you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, it was really stimulated by Joseph's comments there, and maybe thinking with my training as an economist, thinking there goes a supply side restriction. They're stopping the market developing. And of course, exactly what you're saying there, Martin, what's happened in the UK, and it's with the deregulation of, say, local authorities' service provision, and of course sport is not a statutory one, it's something that can get cut during austerity cuts, is the private sector steps in. So running those facilities will be leisure management contractors, obviously with financial targets, so they will look for profitable opportunities. They will move their centres, which are traditionally around halls and pools, into maybe fitness and multi-use type activity that private agents can actually deliver. We know the single biggest fitness club chain. Can we mention names on here, Martin?
Yeah.
So Pure Gym, for example, comes from nowhere to being the market leader, and they did exactly what you're saying, Martin. Buy up cheap warehousing space, empty retail units, often with car parking, fill it with great kit. You don't run expensive pools or collective activities outside in the sense of football pitches and so on that Graham mentioned. You deliver through private sector or self-employed PTs, personal trainers, the opportunities for people to engage and to co-create their activities that they do. So I think this speaks to some of the things that Matt was talking about cultural change. We are certainly, to use the grand language, further down the neoliberal, which is the kind of market-driven approach to organising society than Sweden. And so you can see that writ across the wider kind of sports system. And of course, that's knocking at the door of Sweden, really. So there's this tension between how much engagement and regulation by authorities versus how much you let people self-organise and create opportunities for themselves. And just one thing to remember is those team sports in the UK didn't develop through state intervention. They developed through community activity. So in a sense, you've got the same processes, just the kind of socioeconomic labels you put on top of them. They're just different. They're self-organized activities. Some are for profit and some are not. But it'd be interesting on Matt's comments on that kind of comparative thing, because that's kind of my take as a sort of an economist looking at these things.
I think the point that you raised there, Paul, around like the emphasis that we had in the UK has really been, and we've put a lot of sort of onus on national governing bodies in particular to try and deliver everything, essentially. So, participation and everything up all the way to winning medals. And I think there seems to be a notable difference between the UK and Sweden here, where we historically have relied on NGBs. I think there's been a step change of emphasis on NGBs to any kind of market provider that government feels can achieve the broader outcomes that it wants to achieve. And I think that's been something that I think is slightly different between the two systems, and how we've changed that emphasis away from the traditional structure, relying less on the traditional governing bodies to deliver, and actually looking elsewhere.
I think you talking about national governing bodies and delivery there is really interesting, because from what I've seen, having some in-depth knowledge of opening school facilities, within the tender documents and the policy, it was suggested that the NGBs will deliver much of this. That's not been the case. There's been hardly any NGBs deliver because they don't really deliver anymore. Not in any real big space. They deliver courses to be qualified, but then who is delivering sport nowadays? It's private coaches. That's the way it's gone, and it almost seems like the government didn't realise that in OSF. And again, with funding, we seem to be throwing funding in loads of different directions, hoping something's going to work. So if you look at it from an education perspective, the primary sport premium, huge amounts of funding over the last 10 years in that space. And then as they realised that wasn't necessarily going where they wanted it to, they brought half in, so the holiday and fed the feeding over school holidays and nutrition and that kind of thing. But that was through local authorities, and that was quite difficult to implement. And then opening school facilities has been through active partnerships and a consortium with YST, UK Active, and Street Games. So at the moment, it seems like they're just kind of going, well, I don't know who's going to do what, and we'll put some money here, there, and everywhere to an extent. Whereas looking at the Swedish system, it seems very centralised, very, very clear of the direction from a funding perspective. I mean, there was obviously the Sport England controversy of them not necessarily knowing where the money was going a few years ago. So it certainly seems like we have this quite fragmented approach to everything, where there's lots of different things going on. You guys in Sweden, it seems to be much more centralised with some clear views of what's going on. But as you mentioned before, Paul, and I assume this is the same in Sweden, there is so much change going on in society that delivering, increasing participation, which generally hasn't happened really too much in the UK, but is just standing still actually a huge achievement, because things like technology or people having different things that they want to do, watching TV more. We've got 1 million channels to watch, playing computer games, all these different things that are out there. Maybe standing still is a really, really big achievement. Paul, do you want to speak to that and come back in on that?
Yeah, for sure. And I was actually just thinking as you were speaking there, Martin, to ask Joseph a question, because again, wearing my economics hat, one of the arguments would be is let 1,000 flowers bloom. In a market system, people deliver things that they want to. Where this matters in the UK narrative is very much around if we're providing public money, which, let's face it, comes through either taxes or some kind of borrowing from government that then is spending money on behalf of you in terms of a wider impact. So there's a kind of an inevitable accountability associated with that. And that leads to the kind of logic that Matt talks about, is that if you're getting public money, we want to see exactly what you deliver. So the focus is on, for want of a better phrase, kind of precisely defined metrics to try to say, yes, we've delivered this. I get the feeling in Sweden, it's different. It's kind of much more about intrinsic about the nature of what society is. It doesn't have that same kind of transactional feel. And I did wonder, posing the question, I'm sidestepping your question, Martin, but I'll be interested in Joseph's view about what is there a challenge of this logic starting to infiltrate what Sweden has traditionally done, because it kind of erodes away that kind of almost intrinsically community feel for sport because of the kind of transactional nature of the way in which we have arrangements, which is why it's dangerous, as Matt says, to make comparisons across different systems.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I think coming back to what we talked about a few minutes ago about the values which our respective systems or not are founded on. I mean, we should remember that the Scandinavian countries, they are very egalitarian. They're old kind of socialist economies, still rely very much on the tradition of the planned economy idea and the egalitarian view on things. So I mean, professional sport was banned up till late 70s. If you went abroad to play professionally, you would be banned for Swedish competition for the rest of your life. So that was just 4 to 5 years ago, and sure, we don't have that now, but we still have the same system. So and talking about all the flowers bloom, I think that we have that in Sweden as well, but in the kind of the planned economy take on it, you can bloom as a flower as long as the flower is a sport club. So you can do almost whatever you want, but the form is set because the government funding is primarily supporting the form. They don't worry so much about what you do in that form. Is it for health reasons? Is it for elite sport reasons? Is it for just social cohesion? The government they don't worry about that. They worry about the form. So as long as you stay within the form, you can bloom in whatever way you want.
I think that's really, really interesting because I'm conscious we've got about 10 minutes left, and I was thinking of the last two questions. One was going to be, what is the purpose of sport? And I think it was, or what's your government's take on the purpose of sport? And I think you've touched on that there already, in that it seems like using sport as a vehicle, but then allowing people to use it in the way that they see most fit. What do you guys think, Matt? What do you think regarding the UK? What do we really see as sport being, or sport being for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, historically, it used to be about sport for all, and again, we haven't really sort of delved into the influence of some of those kind of broader campaigns that have influenced our thinking. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing to hear sort of Josef's this idea that government would simply just give money to sport and say, spend it how you will. It seems sort of almost incomprehensible in the kind of UK context in terms of often we describe it as kind of conditional autonomy or conditional funding, that funding has kind of strings attached. And I think that's certainly historically the last 30 years how government has operated, say, look, we'll give you money, but it's conditional on you achieving this particular outcome, and you must demonstrate that through very clear mechanisms of reporting, which I think just seems such a different system. So, to then sort of say, well, shall we compare policies or shall we compare outcomes seems sort of almost illogical. But I think the assumption that we are making here with the UK versus the Swedish context is that they're kind of similar enough. There are sort of similar like for like comparisons that can be made. And I think they're only meaningful once you get down to the kind of specifics of those concepts that you can compare. So, and as Josef said, the fact that the Swedish system is based on egalitarian and a whole host of values which underpin that. It's very different to the UK. So I think it's hard to pinpoint those specifics, but we do assume that we can make those comparisons.
I think it's worth saying there, sorry, Martin, if I come in there, and this is where I often think it's a typical English or British fudge, really. If you look at the first kind of, I guess, kind of era of modern sport policy with the Blair government and game plan, and Matt's alluded to this before, the so-called twin track strategy of having mass participation and elite sport. It was interesting that 2 examples used in that document was sort of Finland, mass participation, and Australia. And we can be like a bit of both of these things. And certainly with the UK sport thing, the English Institute of Sport followed the Australian model. We imported many overseas international, the best coaches. Fine, you get that. But participation is different. We're talking about something that's intrinsically about people's lives and how it's embedded across their experiences. And this is exactly what Matt's saying. It's the devil's in the detail. You can't just say, I'm going to import a bit of Finland, right? Or Sweden, in the case of Joseph's thing, because people kind of bracket the Scandinavian countries together. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know. But certainly that's what we tend to do and say, look, the Scandinavians are really good at participation. Can we just import what they do? And I think what Matt's alluding to in the light of what Joseph said too is how tricky that might be. In fact, almost impossible, actually, because you're talking about cultural transfer as much of the institutional one. Because we both alluded to the fact that there is funding and there are things that are expected. And actually, this is the non-surprise, they're the same things: health, well-being, social inclusion. Just we're going about these things in quite diametrically opposite kind of mechanisms and approaches, and that's the challenge that policymakers face. You can't just borrow bits from a system. It's like taking a bit out of a Ferrari gearbox and putting it in your tractor to go and plow the field. It just seems meaningless. I'm no engineer. You might be able to do that. Okay.
No, thank you, Paul. Obviously conscious of time, and I knew from our conversations over coffees and whatever that we could talk about this forever, and there's probably so many areas that we've not even touched upon. But I'd just like to finish in the last few minutes, really, to look at what's the future here? Like, how can we make even more of a difference through sport? And it could be totally different answers. You could have an opinion that sport is for all, or no, sport is for the elite, or wherever you want to go with that. You know, what is the future that you see, and what are the changes that you'd like to be seen within Sweden and within Britain or anywhere else for that matter? Joseph, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I have a personal opinion on that, but I think it's more interesting to listen to what people in Swedish sport say about this, because we've done studies posing similar questions and relative to projects and programs and initiatives and plans. And what Swedish sport representatives keeps on saying is that just leave us alone. We will deliver. 9 out of 10 kids have at some point during their upbringing been a member of a sport club. The Swedish elite sport is placed on the 6th place on the medals table. We're doing all right. So please just provide the infrastructure, provide the funding, let us be, we will do good things. Sure, we will do some less good things as well. There will be bullying, there'll be harassment, there'll be non-equality in participation and representation, but on the broader scale, we're doing all right here.
I like your take on that. So much things to touch upon, but conscious of time. Paul, do you want to come in with your thoughts for Britain, UK?
For sure. I mean, there are 2 answers to this. There's one is, what would you like to see? And the things that I think are encouraging from our system is that people do have the opportunity to develop the kinds of activities that they want to do, and they have ways of expressing that, but that's not always open to all sectors of society because of inequalities. I would hate to see that change. But in economic language, I'm an old-fashioned kind of Keynesian. What I would like to see, and I think it's the only way in which government policy really and genuinely influences the wider society's collective good, is where you work within much more tighter frameworks. And here you get into kind of political discourse and ideological difference. So somebody's regulation is somebody else's constraint, right? So do we want clean water at regulation, or is that sort of stopping people getting on with what they want to do? So I like very much what Joseph's saying. Allow the people who are, delegate them the authority to deliver the things that you want. There has to be some accountability to that. Again, question for Joseph would be, let's say that the medal table slips a lot, say for Sweden, would the question get asked? Here they would say that we would kind of have a way of dealing with that, and there'd be a post-games kind of reflection on that, and something like that. But I do feel that one of the biggest challenges to policy delivery in the UK is the fragmentation and the mechanisms for delivery, and we just know that is. It's kind of like you're pushing on or pulling on a lever, but the lever's all different bits of string and elastic, and it doesn't kind of work in a very efficient way. It's far too fragmented. Matt's more of an expert on this and maybe want to comment, but I think the intention is right in our policy, and I think we're trying to do the right things. I just think the mechanisms aren't aligned, and that's the downside of having a more deregulated system. So somehow making that more coordinated, which may mean challenging some of the traditional ways in which we think about economic governance of sport. I think those are things we're going to have to look at seriously if we want to be successful.
Thanks, Paul. Matt, I'm gonna kind of leave the final thoughts on this. So you're going to provide us with all the solutions, because I know you've looked at comparisons across lots of different countries, and I know often you say we can't just parachute things in. But where do you think you see the changes that we need to make in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no kind of one size fits all approach to any of these outcomes in terms of participation or medal success. I think what I'd like to see the future be is stop comparing. I think stop trying to make these kind of quick fix solutions to problems, when in reality, we need to address kind of the more fundamental issues, like the kind of culture, like the values and the priorities. And I think that, what we can learn from Sweden is those lessons learned of sort of, as Paul said, giving the autonomy to clubs, to local authorities to be able to enact in a way that can really make a difference within their local communities. And I think we're seeing a slight step change of that with Sport England investing in kind of place-based partnerships, which, seems a different approach than we have had historically, that I think is a move in the right direction. But I think, and there are many kind of local organizations that, for example, active partnerships, which play a significant role within those kind of geographical communities that we can invest into more. So I think for me, it's sort of less about the kind of top-down imposition and requiring, particularly national governing bodies to have to play a central role, and more about, giving back to the communities and allowing communities, as Josef said, to, be able to achieve the outcomes that they want. So yeah, I think that's probably the future that I would envision, is something a bit more empowered within the local communities, that we want to see that change.
Love it, Matt. Thank you very much. As I said, we're conscious we could talk about this forever. I've really enjoyed speaking to you and learning a bit more about the Swedish system and bringing in that comparison and trying to get that deeper understanding of why potentially we can't steal some things that you're doing, because it just doesn't work from that cultural space. But I do like the way we've kind of closed there, looking at what we can do moving forward in the UK, and particularly mentioning there the Sport England side and the place-based approach, because actually, probably for the first time in a long time, lots of people are saying this seems like a good idea. Whereas usually these policies come in and everyone's like, no, that's not going to work. And this does seem like quite a positive. I think the thing I would add to it is, if we're going to do something, give it time, because a lot of the time we don't give it enough time. And I think, I know, Matt, you said we probably can't steal things, but in terms of stealing that kind of piece from Sweden, actually allow those people who know the system, know what needs delivering, allow them the space to go and do it, instead of restraining people to saying, you've got to deliver this with this and that and the other, which in different areas just doesn't work. Allow people to understand their own area, allow them to get on with it and go and do what they need to do to make these things happen. I think that's a key thing that I would take away from this. But let's continue this conversation. We'll continue it outside of here, but I think it'd be great to kind of come on again, and there's probably many other topics we could talk about in this, but it's been really nice speaking to you all. So yeah, next time you're over, we can certainly all have a coffee. Matt's got coffee that he makes in his own room if we all go and sneak in there. It's really nice. Thanks, Matt. But yeah, lovely talking to you all, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks all.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.